While locals dismissed it as nothing more than an outdated irrigation plan, Thomas Mercer knew his grandfather's faded map wasn't just another forgotten family heirloom. The weathered parchment, carefully preserved between the pages of an old farming almanac, would guide him to a discovery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about Riverdale County. 8 months of careful excavation following the map's peculiar markings would unearth a sealed chamber that would transform not only the Mercer family legacy, but reshape the entire historical understanding of the American colonial frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn light filtered through the ancient oak trees surrounding Mercer Farm, casting dappled shadows across the weathered red barn that had stood sentinel over the property for nearly 2 centuries. Like his father and grandfather before him, Thomas Mercer had devoted his life to cultivating the rolling hills of Riverdale County, his calloused hands intimately familiar with every acre of the land that had been in his family since 1794. The Mercer homestead had weathered countless storms, both literal and metaphorical, standing as a testament to 7 generations of determined farming in the heart of Virginia's fertile countryside. That crisp September morning began like countless others before it, with Thomas inspecting the southern field where the persistent drought had reduced his corn yield for the 3rd straight year. Climate change had altered rainfall patterns across the region, forcing farmers like Thomas to consider alternative water sources beyond the creek that had served his ancestors for generations. The county extension office had suggested drilling a well to tap into the aquifer believed to run beneath his property, but the substantial cost had given Thomas pause. His farm, though still profitable, operated on increasingly tight margins. In an era of corporate agriculture and unpredictable markets. Standing in the field, squinting against the morning sun, Thomas remembered his grandfather Malcolm's frequent assertion that water runs deep under the south meadow. The old man had always claimed there was a reason the grass stayed greener there even in the driest summers. Perhaps, Thomas thought, his grandfather's intuition had been right all along. If he could locate a water source there, it might save him thousands in drilling costs by providing a more precise location for the well. With this thought freshly in mind, Thomas made his way to the farmhouse attic, where generations of Mercers had stored their personal effects. He navigated around dusty furniture and stacked trunks, making his way to the corner where his grandfather's belongings remained largely untouched since his passing 15 years prior. The afternoon light streamed through the single window, illuminating dancing dust motes as Thomas carefully opened the worn leather trunk bearing Malcolm Mercer's initials. Beneath layers of neatly folded clothes and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, Thomas's fingers brushed against something he hadn't seen before, a cylindrical metal container, the kind once used for storing important documents. Curious, he extracted it from the trunk and carefully pried open the lid that had been sealed shut by decades of disuse. Inside, rolled tightly and secured with a brittle leather cord, was a map unlike any Thomas had seen in the family's possession. Carefully, unrolling the delicate parchment on the attic floor, Thomas felt his pulse quicken. The map showed the boundaries of what was unmistakably the Mercer property, but the landmarks depicted were different from the current landscape. Ancient oak trees, most of which still stood, were marked with precise detail. A creek system, including tributaries that had long since dried up, snaked across the illustrated terrain. But what truly captured Thomas's attention were the careful notations around the southern meadow, the very area where he had been contemplating digging a well. The map was dated April 1773, more than 20 years before the first Mercer had officially purchased the land. In the corner, in faded but meticulous handwriting, was an inscription: To locate the primary water source, follow the convergence of the three ancient oaks to where the summer sun casts the shortest shadow at midday, depths marked in rods, Adams, surveyor to the crown. Below this inscription was a series of numbers and measurements using terms unfamiliar to Thomas, but clearly indicating depth and distance. Several spots in the southern meadow were marked with symbols that resembled small fountains or springs. One location in particular, near the center of the field, was circled several times with the annotation, primary source, caution advised, structure below. Thomas's brow furrowed at this last notation, structure below. What kind of structure would be located underground near a water source? Perhaps a natural cave formation or an early attempt at creating a spring house. The map was dated during the colonial period, decades before the American Revolution and years before any Mercer had settled in Riverdale County. As Thomas carefully re-rolled the map, his mind raced with possibilities. He'd studied local history extensively. It was something of a Mercer family tradition, and knew that this area had been sparsely settled during the colonial era, primarily by farmers and traders who had ventured inland from the coastal settlements. There was no record of significant colonial infrastructure in this area, which had been considered part of the frontier at that time. Bringing the map container downstairs, Thomas spread the document carefully across the kitchen table. The same solid oak surface where his grandfather had pored over seed catalogues and weather predictions for decades. Using his phone, he took detailed photographs of the map, then began comparing it to modern satellite images of his property. The three ancient oaks mentioned in the instructions still stood, gnarled sentinels that had witnessed centuries of history. Thomas had always assumed they were boundary markers planted by his ancestors, but the map suggested they predated Mercer ownership of the land. Using mapping software, he overlaid the historical document with current aerial views, adjusting for scale as best he could. The location marked as the primary source appeared to be approximately 50 yards from his current failed well attempt, an area where multiple drilling efforts had been plagued by equipment failures and unusual subterranean obstructions. The county well driller had eventually given up, suggesting they try a different section of the property entirely. Could this old map explain why they'd encountered such difficulties? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas's wife, Eleanor, returned from her job at the County Historical Society to find the kitchen table covered with printouts, the antique map carefully secured under a sheet of clear plastic. "What's all this?" she asked, setting down her bag and peering over his shoulder. "I think Grandpa Malcolm had a secret," Thomas replied, pointing to the map. "This was hidden in his trunk in the attic. It's from 1773, long before any Mercer owned this land." Eleanor, her historian's interest immediately piqued, leaned in closer. "Thomas, this is incredible. The detail is remarkable for a colonial-era map." Her finger traced the careful renderings of topographical features, and these notations, they're not just about water sources. Look at the language, structure below, and caution advised. This isn't a simple survey map. "What do you think it means?" Thomas asked, grateful for his wife's expertise. Eleanor studied the map silently for several moments. "During the colonial period, this area was much more significant than our local history suggests. There were disputes between British loyalists and early independence sympathizers, tensions with indigenous tribes, and rumors of hidden caches established by both the Crown and wealthy colonists preparing for potential conflict." She looked up at Thomas, excitement evident in her eyes. This could be documentation of something deliberately hidden, perhaps a storage vault or emergency supply cache. "Hidden under our southern meadow? That seems far-fetched," Thomas said, though the doubt in his voice was undermined by the quickening of his pulse. "Not really," Eleanor countered. This region was strategically important because of the river access to the coast. And remember, your ancestor Jonathan Mercer didn't purchase this land until 1794, well after the Revolution. There's a gap in the property records. We've never been entirely sure who owned it before him or how it was used. The following morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for Thomas's expedition to the southern meadow. Armed with the map, modern surveying equipment borrowed from his neighbor, and a metal detector he hadn't used since a brief treasure hunting phase in his 20s, he set out to test his grandfather's hidden knowledge. The three ancient oaks stood in an almost perfect triangle, their massive trunks and spreading branches creating islands of shade in the open field. Following the map's instructions, Thomas marked the spot where their theoretical lines converged and waited until midday to observe the shadow patterns. To his amazement, the shadows aligned almost perfectly with the markings on the centuries-old map, accounting for the growth of the trees over time. The metal detector proved less useful than he'd hoped, registering numerous small hits that turned out to be scattered pieces of farm equipment, nails, and other metal detritus accumulated over centuries of agricultural use. But when Thomas brought in a more sophisticated ground-penetrating radar unit, another loan from a neighbor who used it to locate buried irrigation pipes, the results were unmistakable. Approximately 4 feet below the surface, in precisely the location indicated. On the map, there was something solid and geometrically regular, distinctly not a natural formation. The radar revealed what appeared to be a rectangular structure roughly 8 feet by 12 feet in dimension. It could be an old root cellar, suggested Pete Davidson, the elderly neighbor who had come to help with the radar equipment and had stayed out of growing curiosity. My grandfather's farm had something similar, underground storage for keeping vegetables cool before refrigeration. Thomas shook his head, pointing to the map. This was drawn in 1773. Root cellars in this region typically dated to the 19th century, and they were usually adjacent to homesteads, not isolated in fields. And look at the construction indicated here. Stone, not wood. Pete adjusted his worn cap, studying the radar readout with newfound interest. Well, I'll be damned. You might have something historic here, Thomas. Question is, what are you going to do about it? The question lingered in Thomas's mind as he returned to the farmhouse that evening. Eleanor listened intently as he described his findings, her historian's mind already cataloguing the possibilities. We should contact the state archaeological department, she suggested. If this is a colonial-era structure, it falls under historical preservation guidelines. Thomas nodded slowly, though a part of him hesitated. The southern meadow was his best hope for a new well, crucial for the farm's future. Archaeological investigations could take months, even years, potentially placing restrictions on how he could use his own land. Yet the historian in him, the part that had listened to his grandfather's stories about the Mercer legacy as stewards of this land, knew Eleanor was right. Let's do some more investigation first, he compromised. Just to be sure, we're not calling in the authorities for an old septic tank or something equally mundane. Eleanor smiled knowingly. She recognized the gleam in her husband's eye, the same expression he had when piecing together broken antique farm equipment or solving problems with the ancient electrical system in the farmhouse. Thomas Mercer enjoyed a good mystery, especially when connected to his beloved family land. The next day, Thomas began a careful excavation at the site, starting with a small test pit to determine the depth and nature of the structure. Eleanor joined him, having taken a rare day off from the Historical Society, her expertise in local artifacts proving invaluable. 3 feet down, Thomas's shovel struck something solid, not the dull thud of hitting stone, but a sharper, more resonant sound. Dropping to his knees, he began clearing soil with his hands, revealing what appeared to be fitted stones. Not random field stones, but carefully shaped blocks forming what was unmistakably a deliberate construction. "Thomas," Eleanor breathed, brushing dirt from an edge, "these are dressed stones. Look at the precision of the fit. This isn't frontier construction, this is skilled masonry." As they expanded their efforts, the outline of what appeared to be a corner emerged. The stonework was indeed remarkable for its precision, the joints between stones so tight that even after centuries underground, little soil had penetrated between them. "This isn't a root cellar or a spring house," Thomas said, voicing what they both were thinking. "This is something else entirely." By late afternoon, they had exposed enough of the structure to confirm they were dealing with a rectangular construction, with at least one perfectly squared corner. The top of the structure appeared to be a single massive stone slab that would require machinery to move. Continuing by hand was no longer practical. "We need to bring in help," Eleanor said definitively. "Professional help." Thomas nodded, finally convinced. "I'll call Dr. Harrison at the university tomorrow. His archaeological field school has all the proper equipment, and he owes me a favor after I let his students survey the Revolutionary War campsite on the North Ridge last summer." That evening, as they sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and amber, Thomas's phone rang. The screen displayed a name that caused him to frown slightly. Richard Walton, the county's largest real estate developer, and a man who had made no secret of his interest in acquiring the Mercer property for a planned luxury subdivision. "Heard you were digging up the South Meadow today," Walton said without preamble when Thomas answered. "Find anything interesting?" Thomas's grip tightened on his phone. "Just looking for a good well site, Richard. Nothing exciting." "That's not what Pete Davidson said when he stopped by the diner this afternoon. Something about a colonial map and underground structures. Sounds like more than just a well project." Thomas silently cursed the small-town grapevine. Pete was a good neighbor, but famously unable to keep anything to himself. "Just some old farm infrastructure," Thomas replied neutrally. "Probably nothing significant." "Well, if you find you've got more historic preservation headaches than you bargained, for my offer to buy your property still stands. In fact, I might be willing to increase it, given the current development pressures in the county." After ending the call, Thomas relayed the conversation to Eleanor, whose expression darkened. "Walton's been trying to get his hands on this land for years," she said. "He's on the county zoning board now, and rumor has it he's been pressuring the Historical Society to be more flexible about historical designations when they conflict with development opportunities." "All the more reason to get professionals involved quickly," Thomas replied. "Whatever's under our meadow, I want it properly documented before Walton catches wind of its potential significance." Dr. James Harrison, head of archaeology at the State University, arrived the following afternoon with 2 graduate students and enough equipment to suggest he took Thomas's discovery very seriously. After examining the exposed corner of the structure and reviewing the ground-penetrating radar results, his excitement was palpable. "This is extraordinary, Thomas," he said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the colonial map. "The masonry style is consistent with mid-18th century British military construction, not typical civilian work. And the location. This aligns with some research my department has been doing on previously undocumented British installations in this region during the pre-revolutionary period." One of the graduate students, carefully brushing soil from the exposed stonework, called out, "Dr. Harrison, there's something here. Looks like engraving on this cornerstone." They gathered around as the young woman delicately cleared away centuries of accumulated soil to reveal a finely carved insignia. The British Crown above what appeared to be a military designation with a date, 1767. "Good God," Dr. Harrison whispered. This corresponds exactly with Lord Hillsborough's secret directive to establish secure storage facilities in the colonies, a program that was barely mentioned in official correspondence and has been largely dismissed by historians as never having been implemented. Eleanor, kneeling beside the cornerstone, looked up sharply. The Hillsborough directive? But that was specifically for securing Crown valuables and sensitive documents in light of growing colonial unrest. Are you suggesting this might be a royal repository? Dr. Harrison finished, his voice reverent. One of the rumored secure vaults established to protect Crown assets should conflict arise with the increasingly rebellious colonists. Thomas stared at the ancient stonework with new understanding. A British military vault from before the Revolutionary War, hidden on my property? How could something like this have remained undiscovered for so long? The historical record indicates most of these repositories were abandoned or emptied as tensions escalated, Dr. Harrison explained. Many were deliberately concealed to prevent them from falling into revolutionary hands. After the war, with British forces withdrawn and new American authorities established, knowledge of many of these installations was simply lost. The implications hung in the air between them. If this was indeed a royal repository, its historical significance was immense, and whatever might remain inside could be of incalculable historical value. "We need to proceed very carefully," Dr. Harrison advised. "This discovery potentially falls under both state historical preservation laws and federal guidelines for significant archaeological finds. Before we attempt to open the structure, we need proper documentation, permits, and specialized equipment." Thomas nodded, already accepting that his search for a well site had transformed into something far more significant. "How long will all that take?" "Ordinarily, several months," Dr. Harrison admitted, "but given the exceptional nature of this find, I might be able to expedite the process. In the meantime, we should secure the site and maintain confidentiality as much as possible." Thomas thought of Richard Walton's suspiciously timed phone call and nodded grimly. "That might be easier said than done." By the following morning, Thomas's fears proved well-founded. He awoke to find 3 unfamiliar vehicles parked at the end of his driveway: a news van from the local television station, a car bearing the county seal, and Richard Walton's luxury SUV. "This is ridiculous," Eleanor fumed as they watched from the kitchen window. "How did they find out so quickly?" "Small towns," Thomas said resignedly. "Pete probably told everyone at the diner, and from there—" He let the thought trail off as he stepped onto the porch to greet the unwelcome visitors. Richard Walton strode forward, his expensive suit incongruous against the backdrop of the working farm. Beside him walked Diane Reynolds, the county commissioner, known for her pro-development stance, and behind them a reporter and cameraman scrambled to catch up. "Thomas!" Walton called with artificial joviality. "Quite the excitement you've stirred up. The commissioner and I thought we should come see this historic discovery for ourselves." "Mr. Mercer," the reporter interjected, thrusting a microphone forward, "is it true you've discovered a pre-Revolutionary War structure on your property? How do you respond to rumors that it might contain colonial artifacts or even treasure?" Thomas raised his hands, suddenly understanding how quickly events could spiral beyond his control. "There's been a misunderstanding. We're conducting a routine archaeological assessment as part of a water management project. Nothing has been confirmed yet." Commissioner Reynolds stepped forward, her political smile firmly in place. "Now, Thomas, there's no need for modesty. This could be a tremendous opportunity for Riverdale County. Historical tourism is a growing sector. And if your property indeed contains significant colonial artifacts, we should begin planning how to maximize public access and educational opportunities. The subtext was clear enough. The county was already contemplating how to leverage his discovery, potentially limiting his control over his own property. As I said, Thomas repeated firmly, nothing has been confirmed. We're following proper archaeological protocols under Dr. Harrison's guidance from the State University, and until that process is complete, there's really nothing to discuss. Richard Walton's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, proper protocols. Speaking of which, Commissioner Reynolds was just reviewing the county's historical preservation ordinances this morning. Fascinating regulations, particularly regarding the obligations of property owners once significant historical artifacts are identified. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air as Eleanor stepped onto the porch, her expression composed but determination evident in her stance. "Mr. Walton, Commissioner," she acknowledged coolly. "As the county's Assistant Historical Preservation Officer, I can assure you that Thomas and I are well versed in the applicable regulations. The site is being properly secured and documented as we speak, and Dr. Harrison is expediting the necessary permits for further investigation." The mention of Eleanor's professional role seemed to give the Commissioner pause, but Walton pressed on. "The county has resources that could accelerate this process considerably. I've taken the liberty of contacting several private archaeological firms that specialize in rapid assessment, at my own expense, of course." The implication was clear. Walton was positioning himself to gain control over the excavation and, by extension, whatever was discovered. "That won't be necessary," came a new voice as Dr. Harrison emerged from around the side of the farmhouse. "The State Historical Preservation Office has already been notified, and under Section 106 protocols, this investigation falls under their jurisdiction, not the county's." Commissioner Reynolds bristled visibly. "The county has concurrent jurisdiction over historical sites within its boundaries. Not when the site potentially contains federal period artifacts predating the county's establishment," Dr. Harrison countered smoothly. "In those cases, state authority takes precedence." The standoff might have continued if not for the arrival of another vehicle, this one bearing the emblem of the State Historical Preservation Office. A tall woman in her 50s emerged, her official identification already in hand. "Dr. Margaret Chen, Director of Archaeological Services," she introduced herself. "My office received Dr. Harrison's preliminary report this morning. Based on the potential significance of this discovery, we're implementing emergency preservation protocols effective immediately." She handed official documents to both Thomas and Commissioner Reynolds. "This property is temporarily designated as a protected archaeological site pending full assessment. Access is restricted to authorized personnel only." The reporter, sensing the shifting dynamics, turned to Dr. Chen. "Can you tell our viewers what makes this discovery so significant that it warrants emergency protocols?" Dr. Chen's measured response revealed she was no stranger to media management. "We have preliminary evidence suggesting this may be an intact colonial-era structure with potential connections to pre-revolutionary British military installations. If confirmed, it would represent one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in this region in decades." As the official procedures unfolded around him, Thomas felt a complex mixture of emotions. The possibility of having discovered something of genuine historical importance filled him with pride, yet he couldn't shake his concerns about what this might mean for the farm's future. The well he desperately needed, the autonomy to work his land as 7 generations of Mercers had done before him. Dr. Chen seemed to sense his unease and approached him while the others were distracted by the media presence. Mr. Mercer, I understand this situation presents challenges for you as a working farmer, she said quietly. I want to assure you that our goal is not to impede your livelihood. The emergency protocols are primarily to prevent unauthorized tampering or exploitation while we assess the site's significance. And after that assessment? Thomas asked. That will depend on what we find, she acknowledged candidly. But landowners who work cooperatively with our office typically find we're reasonable partners. Your grandfather's map is already an invaluable contribution to our understanding of colonial infrastructure in this region. Thomas nodded, slightly reassured but still harboring reservations. Watching Richard Walton and Commissioner Reynolds conferring with tight expressions, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle for control over his discovery was just beginning. That evening, as the various officials and media representatives finally departed, Thomas and Eleanor sat at their kitchen table reviewing copies of the documents Dr. Chen had provided. The preliminary protection order would remain in effect for 30 days, during which time a full archaeological assessment would be conducted under state supervision. It could be worse, Eleanor said, scanning the regulations. The state has a better track record of respecting landowner rights than the county does, especially with Walton's influence on the zoning board. Thomas nodded absently, his attention focused on his grandfather's map, which he'd retrieved from the state archaeologists after they'd thoroughly documented and photographed it. What I don't understand, he said, is why my grandfather had this map in the first place, and why he never mentioned it, despite his love of family history and local law. Eleanor considered this. The map is from 1773, but your family didn't acquire the land until 1794, right? Perhaps when Jonathan Mercer purchased the property, this map was included in the transaction, a survey document that stayed with the land deed. But that doesn't explain why Grandpa Malcolm kept it hidden in that metal container in his trunk, not with the other family documents, Thomas countered. Eleanor reached for the map, studying the faded markings with renewed interest. The inscription mentions, "Caution advised regarding the structure. Maybe your grandfather understood what this represented and deliberately kept it protected." Protected from what? History is rarely simple, Thomas. During the revolutionary period, allegiances shifted and fortunes were made and lost based on which side people supported. If your ancestors acquired land that contained a British military installation, they might have had complicated reasons for keeping that knowledge limited. Thomas's phone chimed with a text message from Dr. Harrison. Preliminary ground imaging complete. Structure is intact and sealed, opening scheduled for tomorrow with specialized equipment. State authorities approved expedition process given unique circumstances. Be there at 8 a.m. if you want to witness history. Thomas showed the message to Eleanor, who read it with widening eyes. They're moving incredibly fast, she observed. The State Historical Office must consider this exceptionally significant. Or they're worried about something, Thomas suggested. Did you notice how Dr. Chen reacted when she saw the British insignia on the cornerstone? She tried to hide it, but she was definitely concerned about something more than just historical preservation. The following morning dawned clear and cool as Thomas and Eleanor made their way to the excavation site. Overnight, the state archaeological team had transformed the southern meadow into a proper dig site, with canopies, equipment stations, and carefully marked access paths. The exposed corner of the structure had been fully uncovered, revealing what was unmistakably a doorway constructed of the same precision-cut stone as the walls. Dr. Chen greeted them, now dressed in field clothes rather than her official attire from the previous day. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, thank you for your cooperation. We've completed the preliminary assessment, and I'm pleased to inform you that we'll be able to access the structure today. That seems remarkably fast, Eleanor noted. I've worked on historical projects that took weeks just to get the preliminary paperwork approved. Dr. Chen nodded, acknowledging the observation. The circumstances are exceptional. The imaging reveals an intact sealed chamber with no sign of previous entry or disturbance since its original closure. That kind of pristine colonial era site is almost unheard of. Additionally, she hesitated, then continued more quietly, certain aspects of the inscription and construction suggest this facility may have contained materials of significant historical sensitivity. Sensitivity? Thomas prompted. Communications, military, documents, potentially intelligence materials, Dr. Chen explained. If this is indeed one of Lord Hillsborough's repositories, it may contain primary source documents relating to British governance and military planning in the critical pre-revolutionary period. A historical treasure trove that would transform our understanding of that era. As they spoke, a team of specialists was preparing equipment near the now fully exposed doorway. The entrance was sealed with a massive stone slab set directly into grooves in the surrounding structure, with no visible hinges or handles, designed not to be opened from the outside. Dr. Harrison approached, excitement evident beneath his professional demeanor. "We're ready to proceed. The imaging shows no structural concerns, and the air quality sensors we've inserted through the minimal gaps show a stable, if stale, atmosphere inside." "How exactly do you plan to open it?" Thomas asked, eyeing the imposing stone slab. "Very carefully," Dr. Harrison replied. "This type of seal suggests the entrance was designed to be opened with specific tools that would have been available to British military engineers. We've fabricated replicas based on period designs." The process was painstaking and precise. Under Dr. Chen's supervision, the specialists inserted custom-made metal tools into nearly invisible slots at the edges of the stone slab. After considerable adjustment and careful pressure, there was a distinct sound. Not quite a click, but a shifting of weight as some ancient mechanism released its hold. "It's disengaged," announced the lead specialist. "The counterweight system appears to be intact. With your permission, Dr. Chen, we'll begin the extraction process." Using a combination of modern lifting equipment and techniques designed to minimize any potential damage to the historical structure, the team slowly, incrementally, began to move the massive stone slab. As it shifted outward, revealing the darkness beyond, a rush of air escaped from the chamber, air that had been sealed inside for nearly 2.5 centuries. The assembled specialists fell silent as the entrance was fully revealed, a perfectly preserved doorway leading into absolute darkness. The air that emerged carried a musty but not unpleasant scent: dry stone, old paper, and something metallic. "Atmospheric readings are stable," confirmed a technician monitoring equipment nearby. "Oxygen levels normal, no detected hazards." Dr. Chen turned to Thomas and Eleanor. "As the property owners and the ones who discovered this site, would you like to be among the first to enter, with proper precautions, of course?" Thomas glanced at Eleanor, who nodded almost imperceptibly, her historian's excitement evident beneath her professional composure. "We would be honored," Thomas replied, "equipped with protective gear, headlamps, and specific instructions not to touch anything without direction from the archaeological team." Thomas and Eleanor prepared to enter the chamber alongside Dr. Chen and Dr. Harrison. Before they could proceed, however, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Richard Walton's SUV appeared at the edge of the field, followed by a county sheriff's vehicle and what appeared to be an official state car. The group exchanged concerned glances as Commissioner Reynolds emerged from Walton's vehicle, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. "What now?" Thomas muttered. "Dr. Chen," called Commissioner Reynolds as she approached. "I'm afraid we need to temporarily halt this operation. The county has filed an emergency injunction regarding jurisdictional authority over this site." The man with the briefcase stepped forward. "Roger Thornton, County Attorney. We have reason to believe this excavation falls under county historical preservation statutes rather than state control. Until the court resolves this dispute, all activities must cease." Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral, though Thomas detected a flash of something, anger, concern, before she responded. "Mr. Thornton, I appreciate the county's interest, but the state's authority in this matter is quite clear under both state law and the National Historic Preservation Act, particularly given the potential colonial military significance." Nevertheless, Thornton persisted, "we have a signed temporary restraining order from Judge Williams." He extended a document from his briefcase. As Dr. Chen reviewed the order, Richard Walton approached Thomas and Eleanor with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I tried to warn you about getting entangled in bureaucratic red tape. Historical finds are wonderful, but they come with complications that can tie up your property for years." "Is that why you're pushing this injunction?" Thomas asked directly. "To complicate things enough that I'll reconsider your offer?" Walton smiled thinly. "I'm simply supporting the county's legitimate interest in ensuring proper procedures are followed, but my offer to purchase your property, complications and all, remains open. In fact, given these new developments, I'm prepared to increase it substantially." Before Thomas could respond, another vehicle arrived, this one bearing federal government plates. A middle-aged woman in a crisp suit emerged, accompanied by two men whose bearing suggested law enforcement training despite their civilian clothes. "Catherine Langdon, Department of the Interior," she announced, approaching the increasingly crowded site. "This location has been designated as a potential site of exceptional historical significance under federal preservation statutes." She turned to Dr. Chen with a nod of recognition before addressing the county representatives. "Any local injunctions are superseded by federal authority in this matter. My office has been monitoring Dr. Chen's assessment and has determined this site warrants immediate federal protection." Commissioner Reynolds bristled visibly. "This is an outrageous overreach. The federal government can't simply swoop in and claim authority over county land without proper—" "I assure you, Commissioner, every proper procedure has been followed," Langdon interrupted smoothly. "The preliminary findings regarding this site's connection to pre-revolutionary British military installations trigger automatic federal involvement under multiple statutes." As the jurisdictional dispute escalated among the various officials, Thomas found himself increasingly sidelined. On his own property, Eleanor slipped her hand into his, squeezing gently in silent support. "This isn't about historical preservation anymore, is it?" he whispered. "It rarely is," she replied softly. "This is about control. Who gets to claim the discovery? Who controls the narrative, and ultimately who benefits from whatever is found inside?" Thomas looked back at the open doorway to the underground chamber, the mysterious colonial vault that had remained sealed and waiting for almost 250 years. Whatever secrets it held, they were powerful enough to bring county officials, state authorities, and now federal agents literally to his doorstep, all claiming rightful jurisdiction. His grandfather's hidden map had led him not to a simple site, but to a discovery that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. As he watched the officials argue, Thomas couldn't help but wonder if Malcolm Mercer had foreseen this very scenario, if his decision to keep the map hidden had been a deliberate choice to protect both the land and whatever secrets lay beneath it from exactly this kind of conflict. The underground chamber waited in silence, its contents still unknown, as the bureaucratic battle raged in the Virginia sunshine above. Whatever historical revelations lay within, Thomas realized, would come with complications his morning search. for water had never anticipated. The clamor of competing jurisdictional claims continued for nearly an hour in the field beside the exposed colonial vault. Thomas and Eleanor watched from the sidelines as Dr. Chen engaged in intense discussions with the federal representative, Catherine Langdon, while County Attorney Thornton made increasingly agitated phone calls. Richard Walton maintained his position of casual observation, though Thomas noticed his eyes repeatedly drifting to the open doorway of the underground structure with poorly concealed interest. "This is absurd," Thomas finally muttered to Eleanor. "They're arguing over who has authority while standing on my property, claiming rights to something that's been under my family's land for centuries." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her historian's training temporarily overshadowed by her role as his wife and partner. "You have more power here than you realize," she whispered. "This is still your land, regardless of whatever historical significance has been discovered. They all need your cooperation." The realization straightened Thomas's shoulders. Stepping away from the edge of the debate, he made his way to the farmhouse, returning minutes later with his grandfather's journal, a worn leather volume he'd inherited along with the farm. Approaching the now fractured group of officials, he cleared his throat deliberately. "While you all sort out your jurisdictional disputes," he announced with quiet authority, "I'd like to remind everyone that this remains private property that has been in my family for 7 generations. More importantly, I believe I've found something relevant to our discovery." The announcement had the desired effect. Arguments paused as all eyes turned to Thomas, who held up his grandfather's journal. "My grandfather Malcolm Mercer kept detailed records about this land and its history. I've just found an entry from 1962 that specifically mentions the old stone room in the south field. It seems my family has been aware of this structure for generations, even if we didn't know its historical significance." This was, in fact, a calculated bluff. Thomas had found no such entry, but he needed to regain some measure of control over the situation. The journal itself was genuine. His grandfather had indeed documented farm activities meticulously, but Thomas was counting on none of the officials having the time or opportunity to verify his specific claim. Dr. Chen was the first to approach. "Mr. Mercer, this could be extremely helpful. Would you be willing to share this information?" "I would," Thomas replied steadily, "with whoever is actually going to conduct a proper, respectful investigation of this site, with my family's involvement, and with guarantees that any findings remain connected to this land and its history." Catherine Langdon stepped forward. "The Department of Interior has extensive experience working with private landowners on historical preservation projects. We could draft a memorandum of understanding that specifically addresses your concerns about property rights and historical attribution. The county would certainly be willing to provide similar assurances." Commissioner Reynolds interjected quickly, though her expression suggested this wasn't an offer she'd planned to make. Thomas looked between them, then at Eleanor, who gave him a slight nod of encouragement. "I propose this," he said, addressing the entire group. "A joint investigation, with federal oversight for the historical aspects, state archaeological management for the technical work, and county involvement for local historical context, but with 2 non-negotiable conditions. First, my wife and I are to be included in every stage of the investigation and documentation. Second, no findings leave this property without our explicit consent." The silence that followed suggested he had struck the right balance, assertive enough to command respect, but practical enough to offer a workable solution. After a flurry of hushed conversations and several phone calls, a tentative agreement was reached. The federal authorities would provide overall coordination, with Dr. Chen's team handling the actual archaeology and county representatives serving in an advisory capacity. Richard Walton, notably, seemed displeased with this resolution. As the officials dispersed to formalize the agreement, he approached Thomas one final time. "You're making a mistake, Mercer," he said quietly. "Once the government gets involved, landowner rights tend to evaporate. My offer still stands, and it will be the last chance you have to maintain real control over your property." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "This land isn't just property to me, Walton. It's my heritage, my family's legacy. I'd rather navigate complex historical preservation rules than see it turned into another cookie-cutter subdivision." Walton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see if you still feel that way when the restrictions start piling up. History has a way of becoming a burden rather than a blessing." With the jurisdictional disputes temporarily resolved, the team refocused on the open doorway to the underground chamber. Proper archaeological protocols were established, with documentation equipment set up to record every aspect of the initial entry. Thomas and Eleanor were outfitted with protective gear and given specific instructions on how to proceed alongside the professional team. "Remember," Dr. Chen cautioned as they prepared to enter, "this environment has been sealed for approximately 250 years. Everything inside, air, surfaces, objects, should be treated with extreme care. Follow our lead, touch nothing without direction, and if you feel any discomfort, exit immediately." Thomas nodded, his farmer's pragmatism momentarily overshadowed by the weight of historical significance. They were about to step into a space untouched since before the American Revolution, a perfectly preserved time capsule from the colonial era. The entry passage was surprisingly well constructed, a short corridor with a slightly arched ceiling, built of the same precisely fitted stonework as the exterior. Their headlamps cast dramatic shadows across the ancient masonry as they moved carefully forward. The air was noticeably cooler and carried that same musty, dry scent that had escaped. When the door was first opened, after approximately 10 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber that drew collective gasps from the entire team. The room was rectangular, roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, with an arched ceiling approximately 12 feet at its highest point. The stonework throughout was immaculate, clearly the work of master masons working with exceptional materials and precision. But it was the contents of the chamber that truly astonished them. Instead of the empty room or scattered debris they might have expected after centuries of abandonment, they found a meticulously organized space that appeared to have been prepared deliberately for long-term preservation. Along the walls stood wooden shelving and cabinets, remarkably intact despite their age. Upon these rested dozens of wooden crates and metal boxes, each bearing official-looking seals and markings. In the center of the room stood a large oak table with an inlaid surface surrounded by several high-backed chairs, a meeting space or work area that had waited patiently for occupants who never returned. Most striking of all was the condition of everything: the lack of significant deterioration, the absence of animal or insect damage, the preservation of paper and textile elements that should have decayed centuries ago. "My God," breathed Dr. Harrison, "it's as if they sealed it yesterday. The preservation is unprecedented." Dr. Chen moved forward carefully, her trained eyes assessing the scene with professional precision. The environmental conditions must be nearly perfect. Cool, dry, completely sealed against the elements and pests. And look at the construction details. There's evidence of advanced engineering knowledge in the ventilation system. She pointed to small, strategically placed openings near the ceiling, channels that appeared to connect to the surface through carefully designed filtration systems. "This wasn't just a storage vault," she continued. "It was designed for long-term preservation and potential human occupation. This level of sophistication in environmental control is far beyond what we typically attribute to colonial-era construction." Eleanor approached one of the wooden crates, careful not to touch it, studying the markings visible on its exterior. "These are official British Crown markings," she noted. "And look at the classification symbols. These indicate highly restricted military materials. If I'm reading the coding correctly, this particular crate would have contained communications from the highest levels of the colonial administration." Catherine Langdon had been documenting everything with a specialized camera, but paused at Eleanor's observation. "Mrs. Mercer, your expertise in colonial documentation is impressive." Eleanor smiled slightly. "The County Historical Society might be small, but we've specialized in colonial record systems. These markings match patterns we've documented in official colonial correspondence from the 1760s and 1770s. Thomas, meanwhile, had been drawn to something else entirely, a section of the far wall where a different type of cabinet stood. Unlike the official-looking storage containers elsewhere in the room, this appeared to be a more personal collection, leather-bound volumes and document cases arranged with care. "Dr. Chen," he called, "there's something different here." The archaeologist joined him, examining the collection without touching it. "These appear to be personal records or journals, not official materials. The binding styles and materials are consistent with private documentation rather than government records." As the team continued their initial survey, documenting everything meticulously before any physical examination would begin, Thomas found himself strangely moved by the reality of what they had discovered. This wasn't simply a historical curiosity, it was a deliberately created time capsule, sealed away by people who clearly intended to return, but never did. The American Revolution had intervened, transforming the colonies into a nation and rendering this British military installation obsolete and forgotten. For hours, the team worked methodically, mapping the chamber's contents and establishing protocols for the detailed investigation that would follow. Environmental monitoring stations were installed to track any changes in temperature, humidity, or air composition that might affect the preserved materials. Specialized photography captured high-resolution images of every surface and object. It was during this meticulous documentation that Eleanor noticed something peculiar about one of the personal document cases. "There's different handwriting on this one," she observed. "The official materials all have standardized script, but this has been labeled in a more informal hand." Dr. Chen examined it carefully. "You're right, and the ink appears slightly different as well, possibly added later than the original materials." She made a note to prioritize this case for early examination once the preservation team had established safe handling protocols. As evening approached, temporary lighting was installed in the chamber and security measures were established around the site. The team would need to carefully manage access to the underground structure to prevent environmental damage from too many people or uncontrolled conditions. "We should have preliminary handling protocols established by tomorrow afternoon," Dr. Chen informed Thomas and Eleanor as they prepared to exit the chamber for the day. "With your permission, we'd like to begin the careful examination of documents and materials at that time." "Of course," Thomas agreed. "But I'd like to be present for the initial openings." "Absolutely," Dr. Chen confirmed. "As we agreed, you and Mrs. Mercer will be included in every stage of the process." That evening, the Mercer farmhouse became an impromptu command center. The kitchen table was covered with preliminary documentation, and the living room hosted ongoing consultations between various experts who had been called in. Thomas observed with a mixture of amazement and anxiety as his quiet farmhouse transformed into a hub of historical investigation. "How are you holding up?" Eleanor asked quietly, joining him on the porch, where he had stepped out for a moment of peace. Thomas considered the question seriously. "It's overwhelming," he admitted. "Yesterday, I was worried about drilling a well and keeping the farm running through another drought season. Today, I'm hosting federal agents and archaeologists because we've apparently discovered a historically significant British military vault from before the Revolution." Eleanor leaned against him, her presence reassuring. "It's a lot to process, but think about what this means. Not just for history, but for your family's legacy. The Mercers have been stewards of this land for generations, and now we've discovered it holds secrets that could transform our understanding of colonial America." Thomas nodded slowly. Grandpa Malcolm must have known something. The way he hid that map, how specific his notes were about water running beneath the South Meadow. He was pointing me toward this discovery without explicitly revealing it. "Maybe he was waiting for the right time," Eleanor suggested, "or the right Mercer to make the discovery." Inside the house, they could hear the excited discussions, continuing as experts debated the potential historical significance of various aspects of their discovery. Through the window, Thomas could see Dr. Chen and Catherine Langdon engaged in intense conversation, both occasionally glancing at documents spread before them. "There's something they're not telling us," Thomas observed quietly. "Langdon especially. She's too interested in those personal document cases for this to be purely about historical preservation." Eleanor studied the federal agent thoughtfully. "The Department of Interior doesn't typically send senior representatives for routine historical discoveries, even significant ones. There's definitely more to her involvement." Their speculation was interrupted by Roger Thornton, the county attorney, who stepped onto the porch with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, I wanted to speak with you privately," he began, glancing back to ensure they weren't overheard. "Commissioner Reynolds has asked me to prepare a report on the county's legal options regarding this discovery. She's particularly interested in potential tourism and development opportunities." Thomas frowned. "The agreement we reached today specifically addressed preservation and research priorities. There was no mention of tourism development." Thornton nodded uncomfortably. "I understand, and I'm not personally advocating for this approach, but I felt you should know. Commissioner Reynolds and Mr. Walton had a lengthy phone conversation this afternoon. The phrase historical attraction development was used repeatedly. They're already planning how to commercialize this," Eleanor concluded, her expression hardening, "before we even understand what we've found." "I believe so," Thornton confirmed. "I'm telling you this against my professional interests because my family has farmed in this county for almost as long as yours. The way certain developers have been changing the character of our community." He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. "Just be prepared. The county board meeting on Thursday will likely include a proposal for a historical tourism initiative centered on your property." After Thornton departed, Thomas and Eleanor remained on the porch, processing this new complication. The discovery that had seemed primarily academically significant that morning was rapidly becoming a focal point for competing political and commercial interests. "We need to be proactive," Eleanor decided. "Before Thursday's meeting, we should have our own proposal prepared, one that balances historical preservation with reasonable public access, but maintains our control over the property." Thomas nodded slowly. "And we need to better understand exactly what we've found. Something about those personal documents has the federal government unusually interested. Before we can protect our interests, we need to know what we're actually dealing with." The following morning brought a flurry of activity to the excavation site. Additional equipment had arrived overnight, including specialized conservation tools, and a mobile laboratory for document analysis. The team had expanded to include several conservation specialists and a historian from the Smithsonian with expertise in colonial-era documents. Thomas and Eleanor arrived early, determined to be present for the first formal examination of the vault's contents. They found Dr. Chen already at work, coordinating the day's activities with methodical precision. "Good morning," she greeted them. "We're ready to begin the preliminary examination of selected items. The conservation team has established protocols for safe handling, and we've prioritized several documents that appear particularly significant." As they prepared to re-enter the chamber, Catherine Langdon arrived, accompanied by a man Thomas didn't recognize. Distinguished-looking in his 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. and Mrs. Mercer," Langdon introduced. "This is Dr. William Hayes from the National Archives. His expertise in pre-revolutionary documents is unparalleled, and he's joined us to assist with the evaluation of the materials we've discovered." Dr. Hayes shook their hands with genuine warmth. "This is a remarkable discovery you've made, Mr. Mercer, potentially one of the most significant colonial-era finds in decades. I'm honored to be involved." Together, they descended into the chamber, now properly illuminated and carefully monitored for environmental stability. The conservation team had established a work area near the entrance, with specialized equipment for handling and documenting fragile historical materials. Dr. Chen indicated the personal document case Eleanor had noticed the previous day. "We'd like to begin with this one, given its unique characteristics. The different handwriting suggests it may have been added to the collection separately from the official materials. With painstaking care, wearing specialized gloves and using tools designed to minimize any risk of damage, Dr. Hayes gently opened the leather case. Inside, they found several bound journals and a collection of loose papers, all remarkably well preserved. "Extraordinary," Dr. Hayes murmured, gently lifting the topmost journal. "The paper quality and binding techniques are consistent with a mid-18th century private documentation, but the preservation is remarkable, almost no degradation despite the passage of centuries." Using specialized equipment, he carefully opened the journal to its first page. The handwriting was clear and elegant, the ink still vividly legible. Dr. Hayes read aloud, "Personal accounts of William Harrison, Royal Surveyor to the Colonial Office of Virginia, 1767-1774, to be held in confidence until such time as circumstances permit their proper dissemination." Eleanor leaned forward, her historian's interest piqued. A personal journal of the Royal Surveyor? That would be an incredible historical resource in itself. These officials had unique access to information about colonial development and crown policies. Dr. Hayes nodded, carefully turning to the next page. Harrison was noted in official records, but very little of his personal documentation has survived in public archives. This could fill significant historical gaps. As he continued to examine the journal's early entries, his expression grew increasingly intrigued. This is more than just a personal account. Harrison appears to have been documenting discrepancies between official surveys and actual colonial settlements, specifically noting areas where colonial authorities were understating population and development in their reports to London. "Why would they do that?" Thomas asked. "Taxation," Eleanor suggested immediately. "Royal taxes were often based on population and development metrics. Underreporting would have reduced the colony's tax burden." "Precisely," Dr. Hayes confirmed. But Harrison goes further. He suggests these misrepresentations were part of a coordinated effort among colonial officials, including some who publicly professed complete loyalty to the Crown, to gradually prepare for greater autonomy. He carefully turned additional pages, his expression growing more animated. "This is remarkable. Harrison was documenting early independent sentiments among supposedly loyal officials as far back as 1767, significantly earlier than most historical accounts suggest. Such ideas were widespread among colonial leadership. Catherine Langdon had been observing silently, but now moved closer. "Does he mention any specific officials by name?" Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. "He does, including several whose historical reputations suggest they remained loyal to the Crown until much later. This challenges significant aspects of our understanding of pre-revolutionary political alignments." As the examination continued, the journals revealed themselves to be far more than personal observations. William Harrison had apparently been maintaining a detailed account of the growing independence movement within Virginia's colonial government, documentation that would have been considered treasonous by British authorities at the time. He was creating a record, Eleanor realized, documenting the early stages of what would become the revolution, but from inside the colonial administration. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're primary source documents that could rewrite our understanding of how independence sentiment developed. Dr. Hayes carefully examined the final journal, dated 1774. The last entries are particularly telling. Harrison writes of securing these accounts against discovery as tensions with Britain increased. He specifically mentions this vault as a secure repository constructed under pretense of Crown storage, but intended to preserve these truths for history's judgment. The implications were stunning. The underground chamber hadn't been simply a British military storage vault. It had been deliberately repurposed by a royal surveyor to preserve documentation of the colony's gradual progression toward independence, hidden beneath the guise of official Crown business. This explains the sophistication of the preservation measures, Dr. Chen noted. Harrison wasn't just storing documents. He was deliberately creating an archive for future generations. He designed this chamber to protect these records through the coming conflict, regardless of its outcome. Thomas found himself staring at the journals with newfound appreciation. So my land doesn't just contain a British military vault. It houses what might be one of the earliest intentional archives of American independence sentiment, created by someone embedded within the colonial administration. Created at enormous, impersonal risk, Dr. Hayes added. Had these journals been discovered by British authorities, Harrison would have faced charges of treason. The final entry suggests he was preparing to join the growing resistance movement, but planned to maintain his official position as long as possible to continue his documentation efforts. Eleanor turned to Catherine Langdon, whose intense interest now made more sense. "This is what brought the Department of Interior in so quickly, isn't it? You suspected this might be more than just a British military storage facility." Langdon nodded, dropping some of her official reserve. "We received Dr. Chen's initial report describing the British Crown insignia alongside the date, which aligned with period when we know several document caches were established. The possibility of finding intact colonial-era documentation of pre-revolutionary governance is extraordinarily rare, but this," she gestured to the journals, "this exceeds even our most optimistic expectations." As the morning progressed, the team continued their careful examination of Harrison's journals, documenting each page and gradually piecing together a narrative that challenged conventional historical understanding. The surveyor had maintained detailed records of meetings, conversations, and correspondence that revealed a much earlier and more organized movement toward independence than standard historical accounts suggested. This will require significant reassessment of multiple historical assumptions, Dr. Hayes noted, as they documented a particularly revealing passage about early independence discussions among Virginia's leading families. Harrison names individuals and describes sentiments that contradict many established historical narratives. For Thomas, watching the historians and archaeologists work through his discovery, the full magnitude was finally sinking in. His search for water had uncovered something far more precious, a hidden historical treasure that would transform understanding of America's founding period. Yet even as the academic excitement grew around him, he couldn't forget Thornton's warning about the county's intentions, or Richard Walton's persistent interest in acquiring his land. The historical significance of this discovery was becoming clearer by the hour, but so too were the complications it would bring to his family's simple farming life. By mid-afternoon, news of the historical significance of Thomas's discovery had spread beyond the professional team working at the site. Local media vans lined the rural road leading to Mercer Farm, and Thomas's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters seeking comments. The magnitude of what lay beneath his southern meadow was becoming clear not just to historians, but to the wider world. This wasn't merely an interesting colonial relic, but potentially a watershed discovery that could reshape understanding of America's journey to independence. Dr. Hayes had established a temporary document processing station in Thomas's barn, where the most significant journals were being carefully photographed and transcribed. The conservation team worked with meticulous precision, each page treated as the irreplaceable historical treasure it was. Thomas watched as centuries-old secrets emerged from William Harrison's elegant handwriting, painting a picture of colonial Virginia that textbooks had never captured. "Listen to this entry from September 1772, Dr. Hayes called out, excitement overriding his usual academic reserve. Harrison writes, "Today I attended a meeting at Williamsburg ostensibly to discuss survey boundaries for the Western Territories. Present were Governor Dunmore, who maintains his loyalist facade with convincing vigor, and 7 prominent landowners. Once servants were dismissed and doors secured, the true purpose emerged. Discussion of correspondence from Massachusetts regarding the formation of committees of correspondence. Virginia's participation was decided by unanimous consent, though no official record will reflect this decision. The gap between public loyalty and private conviction grows wider among the colony's leadership with each passing month." Eleanor leaned forward, her historian's training bringing immediate context. The committees of correspondence weren't supposedly established in Virginia until March 1773, this suggests the groundwork was being laid months earlier with the governor's knowledge. That contradicts everything we've understood about Dunmore's position. Catherine Langdon nodded, making notes as Dr. Hayes continued his careful examination. Harrison was documenting the hidden infrastructure of revolution, the meetings, decisions and networks that wouldn't appear in official records because they would have been considered treasonous. Thomas found himself increasingly drawn into these historical revelations, momentarily forgetting his concerns about the farm's future. The immediacy of Harrison's first-person accounts brought the pre-revolutionary period to life in ways no textbook ever had. The secret meetings, the calculated public personas maintained by colonial officials who privately supported independence, the gradual building of resistance networks disguised as mundane colonial administration. "Mr. Mercer," called one of the conservation specialists, "we've found something that might interest you particularly." She carefully lifted a folded document from one of the storage boxes. "This appears to be the original land survey for this property, dated 1767. Harrison's notations indicate this area was designated for a prominent Virginia family loyal to independence causes, though the transfer couldn't occur until after the anticipated conflict." Thomas examined the carefully preserved map, a detailed survey of what was now his farm, with topographical features meticulously rendered and water sources clearly marked. Harrison's marginal notes described the property's strategic advantages, including its proximity to transportation routes and self-sufficiency potential. He was preparing safe havens, Eleanor realized, studying the document, identifying properties that could sustain rebel supporters if conflict erupted. That explains why this vault was constructed here. Harrison was using his position as royal surveyor to create infrastructure for the revolution while appearing to serve crown interests. This revelation cast Thomas's family history in an entirely new light. The first Mercer hadn't simply purchased a promising farm in 1794, he had acquired land specifically selected for its strategic value to the independence movement. Land that had housed a secret archive of pre-revolutionary planning. As these historical insights accumulated, Thomas noticed Catherine Langdon engaged in an intense phone conversation at the edge of the barn. Her expression was serious, and she repeatedly glanced toward the excavation site during the discussion. When she concluded the call, she approached Thomas and Eleanor with what appeared to be carefully measured professionalism. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, given the extraordinary significance of these findings, my department is preparing to designate this site for special protection under the National Historic Preservation Act. This would provide additional resources for conservation and research, along with certain protections for the historical integrity of the discovery. Thomas recognized the careful language of bureaucracy, benefits described clearly while implications remained strategically vague. And what would this designation mean for our farm operations and property rights? Langdon maintained her professional demeanor. There would be certain restrictions on activities that might impact the archaeological site, primarily in the immediate vicinity of the vault. But we're committed to working with landowners to ensure their needs are respected while protecting irreplaceable historical resources. Before Thomas could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. I see the federal government is already moving to restrict your property rights, just as I predicted. Richard Walton stood in the doorway of the barn. Commissioner Reynolds at his side. Neither had been invited to the documentation session, but they projected an air of authority as they surveyed the historical materials spread across the temporary workstations. Mr. Walton, this is a controlled conservation environment, Dr. Chen said firmly. We need to maintain specific conditions for document preservation. Walton smiled thinly. Of course, Dr. Chen. We wouldn't want to interfere with the important work of seizing control of Mr. Mercer's property in the name of historical preservation. He turned to Thomas. The county board has called an emergency session for this evening to address the implications of your discovery. I strongly suggest you attend to protect your interests. After Walton and Reynolds departed, an uncomfortable silence hung over the barn. The historical excitement of the morning had been abruptly overshadowed by the political and legal complications that were rapidly accumulating around Thomas's discovery. I know this is becoming complicated, Dr. Hayes said quietly, setting aside Harrison's journal, but I hope you understand the genuine historical significance of what you've found. These documents may fundamentally change our understanding of the American Revolution's origins and organization. Thomas nodded, appreciating the historian's candor. I understand the historical value. What concerns me is that everyone seems to have plans for my property now, federal designations, county tourism initiatives, while my family's 7 generations of stewardship count for nothing in the discussion. Eleanor placed her hand on his arm. Then we need to take control of the narrative. Instead of reacting to everyone else's agenda, we need to establish our own vision for how this discovery should be handled. That evening, Thomas and Eleanor arrived at the county administration building to find the parking lot full and the meeting room overflowing. News of the discovery had spread throughout the community, drawing an unprecedented crowd to the emergency session. Farmers from neighboring properties, local business owners, history enthusiasts, and media representatives packed the space, creating a buzz of anticipation. Commissioner Reynolds called the meeting to order with evident satisfaction at the turnout. As many of you have heard, Riverdale County has become the site of a historical discovery of national significance. The Mercer Farm property has yielded a perfectly preserved underground structure from the colonial era containing documents of extraordinary historical value. Thomas noted how she framed the discovery as belonging to the county rather than to his family's property. It was a subtle but telling indication of her perspective. The county administration has been working diligently to determine how best to manage this remarkable opportunity, Reynolds continued. We've prepared a preliminary proposal for a Riverdale County historical tourism initiative centered around this discovery. At her signal, a county employee distributed printed materials to the board members and displayed a presentation on the large screen. The proposal outlined an ambitious development plan featuring a visitor center, guided tours, educational programs, and infrastructure improvements, all centered on the Mercer property. Our Economic Development Office estimates this initiative could draw up to 50,000 visitors annually, generating significant revenue for local businesses and creating dozens of jobs, Reynolds explained, her enthusiasm evident. With proper management, this could transform Riverdale County into a premier historical tourism destination. Richard Walton rose to speak next, his developer's vision complementing the Commissioner's tourism focus. My company is prepared to assist with the necessary infrastructure development, including road improvements, parking facilities, and visitor amenities. We've had success with similar historical tourism projects in neighboring counties. Thomas listened with growing alarm as his family farm was effectively parceled out for development, historical tourism, and commercial exploitation, all without a single mention of his family's rights or role as the property's stewards. When the public comment period finally opened, he approached the microphone with Eleanor at his side. "My name is Thomas Mercer," he began, his voice steady despite his rising frustration. "7 generations of my family have farmed the land where this discovery was made. While I appreciate the historical significance of what we've found, I'm disturbed by proposals that treat my property as a public resource to be developed without consideration for my family's legacy or rights." A murmur ran through the crowd as he continued. "The documents we've uncovered reveal something remarkable about American history, but they also reveal something about my family's connection to this land. The first Mercer didn't randomly settle here. This property was specifically selected for its strategic importance to the early independence movement. For over 2 centuries, my family has been unwitting stewards of not just a farm, but of a historical legacy." Thomas paused, looking directly at Commissioner Reynolds. "I'm not opposed to sharing this discovery with the public, but any plan must respect the continuing agricultural tradition of Mercer Farm and acknowledge my family's role as the land's caretakers." Eleanor stepped forward to join him at the microphone. "As a professional historian with the County Historical Society, I can attest to the exceptional significance of these findings. But I'm also a Mercer by marriage, and I believe we have an opportunity to create something more meaningful than just another historical tourist attraction." She outlined an alternative vision, a working historical farm where visitors could experience both the colonial-era discovery and the continuing agricultural tradition that had preserved it. Instead of commercial development, she proposed educational partnerships with universities and historical societies that would maintain the property's character while sharing its historical significance. The Mercer family has been safeguarding this historical treasure for generations without even knowing it, she concluded. That tradition of stewardship should be honored in how we proceed, not cast aside for commercial development. The room erupted in discussion as Eleanor stepped away from the microphone. Many local farmers voiced support for the Mercer's position, while business owners seemed divided between enthusiasm for potential tourism revenue and concern about changing the county's rural character. Dr. Chen, who had arrived midway through the meeting, requested permission to address the board. The archaeological team has only begun to process the historical significance of this discovery, she explained. What we're finding suggests this site may qualify for designation as a National Historical Landmark, the highest level of historical recognition. Such designation would require preservation of the site's historical integrity, which includes its agricultural context. This information shifted the tenor of the discussion. Commissioner Reynolds, visibly reassessing her position, suggested forming a community advisory committee to develop a more collaborative approach. Perhaps we've been too hasty in our planning, she acknowledged. This discovery clearly requires thoughtful consideration of all perspectives. As the meeting adjourned, Thomas found himself surrounded by neighbors offering support and sharing their own family histories in Riverdale County. The community's response was heartening, a reminder that despite development pressures, many still valued the agricultural heritage that had defined the region for generations. Catherine Langdon approached as the crowd thinned. "That was well handled," she said with what seemed like genuine admiration. "For what it's worth, I agree with your perspective. Historical preservation works best when it honors continuing traditions, not just past events." "Then I hope your department's approach will reflect that philosophy," Thomas replied. "I believe it will," she said. "But I should warn you, the historical significance of your discovery continues to grow with each document we examine. Harrison's journals contain information that will attract substantial attention from historians, media, and potentially national political figures. This will get more complicated before it gets simpler." Her warning proved prescient the following morning, when Thomas and Eleanor arrived at the excavation site to find unfamiliar government vehicles parked alongside the archaeological team's equipment. Dr. Hayes greeted them with evident excitement. "We've made an extraordinary discovery in Harrison's later journals," he explained, leading them to the temporary document processing station. His final entries, dated early 1774, reference a hidden compartment within the vault itself, constructed specifically to house what he describes as documents of the highest sensitivity, to be preserved for posterity should our cause prevail. The conservation team had identified a section of the chamber's wall that differed subtly from the surrounding stonework. Careful examination had revealed a concealed cabinet ingeniously integrated into the structure, its existence undetectable, without Harrison's specific description of its location and mechanism. "We've only just begun to document the contents," Dr. Hayes continued, "but their historical significance appears to be exceptional." He carefully lifted a document protected between sheets of conservation material. This appears to be early draft language for what would eventually inform portions of the Declaration of Independence, dated nearly 2 years before Jefferson's famous composition. Harrison attributes these concepts to discussions among Virginia's leading independence advocates as early as 1773. Eleanor examined the document with professional care, her historian's training evident in her methodical approach. The philosophical framework is remarkably similar to the final declaration, but with notable differences in structure and emphasis. This suggests the core principles were being actively discussed and refined much earlier than historical accounts typically acknowledge. "Precisely," affirmed Dr. Hayes. "Harrison appears to have been documenting the intellectual evolution of independence thought among colonial leadership, conversations that were too dangerous to record in any official capacity. What we're seeing is the prehistory of American independence, preserved with remarkable foresight by a man who understood he was witnessing the formation of a new nation. Thomas listened to their discussion with growing appreciation for the magnitude of what his simple quest for water had uncovered. The historical significance transcended academic interest. These documents revealed fundamental truths about the nation's founding that had been lost to conventional history. Catherine Langdon introduced the unfamiliar officials, representatives from the National Archives and the Smithsonian Institution, who had arrived overnight upon learning of the hidden compartment's discovery. The federal government is prepared to provide whatever resources are necessary to properly preserve and study these materials, she explained. But we remain committed to working within the framework you advocated yesterday, respecting your family's continuing relationship with this land. The morning's work proceeded with methodical care as the team documented each item from the hidden compartment. Beyond the draft independence language, they discovered correspondence between colonial leaders that revealed a much more organized and deliberate movement toward revolution than conventional history suggested. Harrison had preserved communications that their authors had likely destroyed for their own safety, creating a unique window into the private thoughts of public figures who carefully maintained loyal facades. As Thomas observed the historian's growing excitement, he was struck by a realization. His grandfather, Malcolm, had likely made the same discovery decades earlier. The carefully hidden map, the specific notations about water sources in the South Meadow, the journal entries about secrets beneath the surface. Malcolm Mercer had found Harrison's vault and made the conscious decision to protect it rather than expose it, preserving it for future discovery. "My grandfather knew," Thomas said quietly to Eleanor as they watched the conservation team at work. "He found this place but chose to keep it hidden, just as Harrison had done 2 centuries earlier. He understood its significance but believed it wasn't yet time for it to be revealed." Eleanor considered this. Perhaps he recognized that proper preservation would require resources beyond what was available then, or maybe he felt the historical understanding wasn't yet ready for what these documents reveal, that they would contradict too many established narratives to be properly appreciated. "Whatever his reasons," Thomas replied, he trusted that someday the right Mercer would make the decision to bring this history into the light. "I think he left the map for me to find when the time was right." This perspective transformed Thomas's understanding of his role in the unfolding events. He wasn't merely a farmer who had stumbled upon a historical curiosity. He was continuing a tradition of stewardship that stretched back through generations, preserving not just land, but historical truth for the moment when it could be properly understood and appreciated. By midday, local and national media had descended on Riverdale County in force. The discovery's significance had captured public imagination, with historical experts appearing on news programs to discuss its potential implications for understanding America's founding period. Thomas found himself thrust into an unexpected spotlight as journalists sought interviews about both the discovery itself and his family's long connection to the property. Richard Walton made a final attempt to leverage the situation, approaching Thomas with what he framed as a generous offer. "The media attention alone will make it impossible to continue normal farming operations," he argued. "Let me take this burden off your hands. My company will purchase the property at triple market value and handle all the complications of historical designation and public access." Thomas studied the developer thoughtfully. "You don't understand what this land means to my family, do you? It's not just property to be bought and sold. It's a legacy we've been entrusted with, a responsibility that stretches back 7 generations. And now we discover even further into American history itself. Woolton's expression hardened slightly. Sentimentality is expensive, Mercer. Historical designations come with restrictions that will limit what you can do with your own land. The government entities swarming over your property now won't leave, just because the initial excitement fades. Perhaps, Thomas acknowledged, but I'm beginning to think my family has been preserving this land for exactly this purpose all along. Not just for farming, but for the historical truth buried beneath it. That's a responsibility I'm not prepared to sell at any price. As the afternoon progressed, Dr. Chen and Dr. Hayes coordinated the establishment of a more permanent conservation facility in one of Thomas's outbuildings. With his permission, specialized equipment was installed to ensure proper handling and preservation of the documents as they were carefully removed from the underground chamber for study and digital documentation. We're establishing a temporary research center right here on the farm, Dr. Chen explained. This will allow us to properly process these materials without removing them from the property prematurely. It also gives us time to develop a long-term preservation plan that respects both the historical significance and your family's continuing role. Eleanor had been working with Catherine Langdon to draft a formal agreement that would protect the Mercer's property rights while ensuring appropriate historical preservation. The document carefully defined the scope of any historical designation, limiting restrictions to the specific areas surrounding the underground chamber rather than the entire farm. This creates a framework for balancing agricultural use with historical preservation, Eleanor explained as she reviewed the draft with Thomas. It acknowledges our family's role as stewards and establishes our continuing right to farm the land while protecting the historical discovery. Thomas studied the document thoughtfully. This is a good start, but I think we need to go further, to establish not just protections, but a vision for how this discovery can be shared while maintaining the land's agricultural character. That evening, as sunlight faded over the Virginia countryside, Thomas walked the perimeter of his property alone, reflecting on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. What had begun as a pragmatic search for water had evolved into a journey of historical and personal discovery that connected his family to the very foundations of American independence. Standing at the edge of the southern meadow, looking back toward the excavation site, where lights now illuminated the work continuing into the evening, Thomas felt a profound sense of purpose. 7 generations of Mercers had farmed this land, passing down not just agricultural techniques, but an unspoken trust to protect something they couldn't fully name, but instinctively valued. His grandfather Malcolm had discovered the secret beneath the soil and chosen to preserve it for future discovery. Now Thomas would need to chart a course that honored both his family's agricultural legacy and the historical treasure they had unknowingly safeguarded for centuries. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Thomas made his decision. This discovery wouldn't mark the end of Mercer Farm's agricultural tradition, but would instead infuse it with new purpose and meaning. The land would continue to be worked. The crops would continue to grow, but now with a deeper understanding of the historical soil from which they sprang. Returning to the farmhouse, where Eleanor waited on the porch, Thomas shared his vision, not just for preserving the historical discovery, but for integrating it into the continuing story of the land and the family that had tended it through the centuries. Harrison preserved these truths for future generations, he said. My ancestors, whether they fully understood it or not, continued that preservation through their stewardship of this land. Now it's our turn to ensure that both the historical truth and the agricultural tradition continue for generations to come. 6 months after Thomas Mercer's discovery of the colonial vault beneath his family farm, the Virginia countryside bloomed with the vibrant colors of early spring. The apple trees in the orchard his great-grandfather had planted burst with pink and white blossoms, and the first tender shoots of corn emerged from the fertile soil of the north fields. Farming continued at Mercer Farm, just as it had for 7 generations, but with transformative differences that reflected the property's newly recognized historical significance. Where the southern meadow had once been simply another field awaiting cultivation, it now housed the Thomas and Eleanor Mercer Center for Colonial Studies, an elegant, understated building designed to blend harmoniously with the rural landscape, while providing state-of-the-art facilities for historical preservation and research. The underground vault itself had been carefully stabilized and preserved, with a specially designed access structure that protected the fragile colonial stonework, while allowing controlled visits by scholars and educational groups. Thomas stood on the farmhouse porch, morning coffee in hand, watching as university students carefully tended the heritage garden they had established as part of an agricultural history program. The garden featured crops grown during the colonial period, cultivated using period-appropriate techniques documented in Harrison's journals and other historical sources. It was one of many educational initiatives that had transformed Mercer Farm into a unique living laboratory where agricultural tradition and historical scholarship coexisted and enriched one another. The Williams University group arrived for their research rotation, Eleanor said, joining him on the porch. Her role had evolved significantly in the months since the discovery. While maintaining her position at the County Historical Society, she now also served as the founding director of the Mercer Center, coordinating research access and educational programming. Dr. Hayes mentioned they're focusing on Harrison's documentation of seed varieties, Thomas replied. I told them they're welcome to compare notes with what we're actually growing in the East Field. Some of those corn varieties aren't that different from what Harrison described. The path to this harmonious integration of farming and historical preservation had not been straightforward. The months following the discovery had brought intense negotiations with various government entities, historical organizations, and local authorities, each with their own vision for how the historically significant site should be managed. Thomas and Eleanor had remained steadfast in their core principles. The agricultural character of Mercer Farm would be preserved. Their family would maintain primary stewardship of both the land and its historical resources, and the educational value of the discovery would be prioritized over commercial exploitation. Their vision had prevailed, thanks in part to widespread community support and the professional respect Eleanor commanded among historians and preservationists. The Mercer Center's funding structure reflected this balanced approach, a combination of grants from historical foundations, research endowments from universities, and a modest trust established by a consortium of federal agencies provided the necessary resources for preservation and research without requiring commercial development. The center operated as a non-profit educational institution, with Thomas and Eleanor retaining final authority over its activities and direction. A familiar truck appeared on the farm's winding driveway, bringing Thomas back to the present moment. Dr. James Harrison, now a regular presence at the farm, parked beside the farmhouse and approached with evident excitement, a leather portfolio under his arm. Thomas, Eleanor, the authentication team at the Smithsonian, has completed their analysis of the final documents from the hidden compartment, he announced, climbing the porch steps. The results are extraordinary. They moved to the kitchen table, where Dr. Hayes carefully removed several detailed reports and high-resolution photographs from his portfolio. The linguistic analysis confirms what we suspected. Several passages in these draft documents showing early independence philosophy contain phrasing and conceptual frameworks that later appear in both the Declaration of Independence and private correspondence among the Founding Fathers. He pointed to particular highlighted sections in the analysis. This confirms that the intellectual underpinnings of American independence were being actively developed and refined years earlier than conventional history has acknowledged, and by a broader circle of colonial thinkers than previously documented. Eleanor studied the reports with professional thoroughness. These findings fundamentally alter our understanding of how independence concepts evolved. Instead of emerging primarily from a small group of prominent figures in the mid-1770s, we're seeing evidence of a much more distributed intellectual development beginning years earlier. Thomas, though not a professional historian, had absorbed enough knowledge over the past months to appreciate the significance. Harrison wasn't just documenting these discussions, he was preserving them, specifically because he understood their historical importance wasn't yet recognized. Precisely, Dr. Hayes nodded. He had the foresight to recognize that the intellectual history of American independence would be simplified and condensed in conventional accounts. He created this archive to preserve the messier, more complex, reality for future generations. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine Langdon, whose relationship with the Mercers had evolved from official oversight to genuine collaboration. She carried several document cases bearing the Department of Interior seal. "The final preservation grants have been approved," she announced without preamble. "The Mercer Center is now officially designated as a National Historical Research Archive with permanent preservation status." This designation represented the culmination of months of careful negotiation. Unlike standard historical site designations that often imposed rigid restrictions on property use, this specialized classification had been tailored to the unique circumstances of Mercer Farm, protecting the historical resources while respecting the continuing agricultural tradition. Additionally, Langdon continued, opening one of the document cases, "I've brought the finalized charter for the Harrison Archive Trust. Once you've reviewed and signed it, the endowment funds will be released to support ongoing research and preservation in perpetuity." The Harrison Archive Trust had been Eleanor's inspiration, a legal and financial structure that would ensure the historical resources discovered on Mercer Farm would remain accessible to scholars while staying connected to the land where they had been preserved for nearly 2.5 centuries. The Trust's carefully crafted terms protected both the farm's agricultural character and the historical materials, regardless of future ownership changes. As Thomas and Eleanor reviewed the documents, Dr. Hayes shared updates on the ongoing research projects spawned by their discovery. Historians at 3 major universities were preparing publications that would significantly revise understanding of pre-revolutionary political development based on Harrison's journals. A documentary series was in production featuring the Mercer Farm discovery as a central example of how hidden historical resources could transform conventional narratives. "The academic impact continues to expand," Dr. Hayes explained. "Harrison's documentation of early independence discussions has opened new avenues of research into how revolutionary ideas spread through colonial society. His accounts of secret meetings and correspondence networks are helping historians reconstruct the actual mechanics of how independence sentiment evolved and spread." Catherine Langdon added her perspective from government historical offices. "The discovery has also prompted a reassessment of historical preservation approaches nationwide. Your model of integrating continuing agricultural use with historical research is being studied as a potential template for other rural historical sites." The conversation shifted to plans for the coming months as additional research teams would arrive to study specific aspects of the Harrison Archive. The Mercer Center's reputation had grown rapidly within academic circles, with applications for research access exceeding available slots. Eleanor had established a rotating schedule that ensured diverse institutional representation while maintaining manageable activity levels that wouldn't disrupt the farm's agricultural operations. The William and Mary linguistics team is particularly interested in Harrison's documentation of how independence terminology evolved, she noted, consulting her calendar. They'll be here for 2 weeks in June, focusing on how specific phrases that eventually appeared in official declarations were tested and refined in private correspondence years earlier. As morning progressed toward afternoon, Thomas excused himself to check on the planting progress in the North Fields. Despite the historical activities that now shared the property, Mercer Farm remained a working agricultural enterprise. Thomas had adapted his farming approach, incorporating some heritage techniques where practical, while maintaining modern sustainable practices for commercial crops. The farm's produce now carried a premium in local markets, its connection to colonial agricultural history creating unique appeal for consumers interested in historical food traditions. Walking the freshly planted rows, Thomas reflected on how profoundly his life had changed in the months since he had set out to solve a simple water supply problem. The drought that had prompted his search for a well site had eventually broken, with adequate rainfall returning to nurture his crops. But the true abundance that had emerged from his discovery couldn't be measured in agricultural yields alone. His grandfather Malcolm's hidden map had led not just to a historical treasure, but to a deeper understanding of his family's connection to the land they had farmed for generations. The Mercers hadn't been merely successful farmers. They had been unwitting stewards of a crucial piece of American history, their agricultural practices inadvertently preserving the underground chamber that Harrison had so carefully prepared. For future discovery, Thomas's phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. School buses arriving. Demonstration requested at Heritage Plowing Site. This was another aspect of the farm's evolved purpose, educational programs that brought students from surrounding counties to experience both historical agricultural techniques and the significance of the Harrison archive. Thomas had discovered an unexpected talent for translating historical farming practices into engaging demonstrations for young visitors, helping them understand the connections between agricultural history and the political developments documented in Harrison's journals. When he arrived at the heritage farming area, he found 60 middle school students gathered around the demonstration field where a team of Percheron draft horses waited patiently in historically accurate harness. These educational demonstrations had become a regular part of farm operations, with Thomas and several trained staff members showing how colonial-era farming techniques connected to the broader historical context revealed in the underground vault. "Welcome to Mercer Farm," Thomas greeted the students, immediately noticing their attention divided between the massive draft horses and their smartphones. "Before we had tractors and machinery, this is how American farms produced the food that sustained communities and eventually fed a revolution." A boy near the front raised his hand. "Why bother doing it the old way when machines are faster?" Thomas smiled, having anticipated this question. That's exactly the right question. Understanding how things were done historically helps us appreciate both what's changed and what remains the same. The farmers who worked this land during Harrison's time in the 1770s faced many of the same fundamental challenges we do today: nurturing plants, building soil health, working with weather patterns. Their solutions were different from ours, but their essential relationship with the land wasn't so different. As Thomas demonstrated the historical plowing technique, explaining how colonial farmers prepared fields for planting, he connected these practical skills to the broader historical context. While farmers were developing these agricultural techniques, the political ideas that would shape America were also being cultivated. Harrison's journals show us that independence wasn't just declared suddenly, it grew gradually, like crops requiring preparation, nurturing, and patience. The students' engagement grew as they were invited to examine the heritage tools and even guide the horses under careful supervision. Thomas had learned that tactile experiences created the most powerful connections between historical concepts and contemporary understanding. By the time the demonstration concluded, even the most technology-focused students had gained appreciation for the physical realities of colonial agricultural life. As the school buses departed, Richard Walton's vehicle appeared on the farm road, a now infrequent but not unexpected visitor. The real estate developer's relationship with the Mercer family had evolved over the months since the discovery. His initial attempts to capitalize on the historical find had been firmly rebuffed, but subsequent interactions had gradually shifted toward reluctant respect. "Impressive operation you've built here, Mercer," Walton acknowledged, surveying the heritage farming area and the tasteful research center visible in the distance. "Not what I envisioned, I'll admit, but effective in its own way." "It's not built, it's grown," Thomas corrected mildly. "We've simply allowed the farm to evolve while honoring what it's always been." Walton nodded, uncharacteristically reflective. "The county board is discussing a comprehensive historical preservation initiative, looking at other properties with potential historical significance. They've asked me to participate, given my development experience." Thomas raised an eyebrow, surprised by this development. "That's an interesting evolution in your business focus." "Let's call it adaptation to market realities," Walton replied pragmatically. "The success of your model has created interest in historical development approaches that preserve rural character while creating educational value. There's economic potential in getting ahead of that trend rather than fighting it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Chen, who had been overseeing the continuing archaeological documentation of the underground chamber's construction techniques. "Thomas, we've completed the structural analysis of the ventilation system. Harrison's engineering was remarkably sophisticated. He incorporated filtration mechanisms that helped preserve the documents by maintaining optimal humidity levels." She noticed Walton and nodded professionally before continuing. "The university architectural team believes these techniques were influenced by European preservation methods not commonly known in the colonies. It suggests Harrison had specialized knowledge beyond his surveying training. This was typical of the continuing discoveries that emerged month after month, layers of historical significance that extended beyond the documents themselves to encompass the sophisticated preservation techniques Harrison had employed. Each new finding further illuminated the surveyor's remarkable foresight in creating an archive specifically designed to survive centuries of burial." As afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, Thomas invited his visitors to join a small gathering at the research center where a milestone was being commemorated. 6 months to the day after the vault's discovery, the complete digital archive of Harrison's journals and documents was being made publicly accessible through a special online platform developed by the Smithsonian in partnership with the Mercer Center. The research center's main hall had been transformed for the occasion, with representatives from historical societies, universities, and government preservation offices gathered to celebrate this new phase of accessibility. Large displays showed high-resolution images of key documents alongside transcriptions and contextual information that made Harrison's insights comprehensible to both scholars and general audiences. Dr. Hayes addressed the assembled guests, his academic reserve giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "Today marks a transformation in how we understand pre-revolutionary America. The Harrison Archive doesn't simply add details to our existing narrative. It fundamentally reshapes our understanding of how independence evolved as both a philosophical concept and a practical movement. Eleanor followed, explaining the educational philosophy that had guided the digital platform's development. Harrison preserved these materials because he believed future generations deserved to understand the complex reality of how America began. Our goal has been to honor that intention by making these resources accessible, not just to specialized scholars, but to anyone seeking to understand this formative period in our nation's development. Thomas observed the gathering with quiet satisfaction. The underground chamber Harrison had created had preserved more than just historical documents. It had protected a more complex, nuanced understanding of American origins than conventional histories had maintained. Now that understanding was becoming accessible to a global audience, fulfilling Harrison's vision across a span of 2.5 centuries. As the formal presentations concluded, guests explored the digital platform and examined displays of high-resolution document reproductions. Thomas found himself approached by an elderly man he didn't recognize, distinguished in appearance, with the bearing of someone accustomed to academic environments. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Professor Samuel Harrison from the University of Virginia. History Department," the man introduced himself. "William Harrison was my ancestor, though, until your discovery, my family had little concrete information about his role in colonial Virginia beyond basic genealogical records." Thomas was momentarily speechless before finding his composure. "Professor Harrison, I don't know what to say. Your ancestors' foresight is the reason any of this exists." The professor nodded, emotion evident beneath his scholarly demeanor. "My family maintained oral traditions, suggesting he had been involved in early independence activities, but conventional historical records showed only his official role as a royal surveyor. For generations, we wondered if the family stories were merely wishful thinking. Your discovery has validated not just historical understanding, but my family's own narrative. This personal connection to the historical figure, whose words and insights had transformed Thomas's life, created a profound moment of recognition. Harrison had preserved these records for future generations without knowing whether they would ever be discovered, just as the Mercer family had unknowingly protected them through centuries of agricultural stewardship. He would be gratified to know his efforts weren't in vain, Thomas said finally, that both the documents and the truths they contain survive to be understood by future generations, including his own descendants. As evening approached, the gathering gradually dispersed, with researchers returning to ongoing projects and visitors departing with new appreciation for the historical resources the Mercer Center now stewarded. Thomas and Eleanor walked Professor Harrison to his car, continuing their conversation about the surveyor's legacy and the impact of his carefully preserved records. After the Harrison descendant departed, Thomas and Eleanor stood in the gentle evening light, surveying the property that had been transformed by what lay beneath its soil. The Mercer farmhouse stood as it had for generations, a symbol of continuity amid change. The new research center and carefully preserved underground chamber represented the property's evolved purpose, not replacing its agricultural heritage, but enriching it with deeper historical context. "Your grandfather would be proud," Eleanor said softly, slipping her hand into his, "not just of the discovery, but of how you've handled it, honoring both the land's history and its future." Thomas nodded, thinking of Malcolm Mercer's careful preservation of the colonial map and his cryptic journal entries about secrets beneath the surface that had only made sense in retrospect. His grandfather had found Harrison's vault decades earlier, but had chosen to protect it rather than expose it, preserving it for the right moment and the right Mercer to bring it into the light. "He understood something I'm only beginning to grasp," Thomas reflected, That stewardship isn't just about maintaining what you can see on the surface. It's about protecting deeper truths until the world is ready to understand them properly. They walked slowly back toward the farmhouse as evening colors painted the Virginia landscape in soft purples and golds. The knowledge hidden beneath their fields had transformed their lives in ways neither could have imagined when Thomas first set out to solve a simple water supply problem. Yet through all the changes, the essential character of Mercer Farm remained, a place where things grew and flourished, now nurturing historical understanding alongside crops. That night, as Thomas reviewed planting schedules for the coming weeks, he received an email from Dr. Hayes with the subject line, "Final translation completed." Opening it, he found that linguistic experts had finally decoded the most challenging sections of Harrison's later journals, passages written in a personal cipher that had resisted conventional analysis. The decoded content revealed Harrison's most private reflections on why he had created the underground archive and what he hoped future generations would understand from its contents. The final entry, dated just weeks before active conflict erupted, read, "I preserve these truths, not knowing whether our cause shall prevail or falter, whether these records will be discovered in my lifetime or centuries hence. What matters is that the complex reality of how liberty takes root survive beyond simplified narratives that inevitably follow revolutionary periods. Should these accounts remain buried for generations, I trust they will eventually find their way into the hands of those who understand that history's greatest value lies not in comfortable myths, but in its messier truths. For a nation to truly know itself, it must understand not just the triumphs of its founding, but the uncertain paths, the contradictions, and the courage of ordinary people who chose liberty before it was certain or safe to do so." Thomas read these words several times, struck by how perfectly they captured what had unfolded on his property. Harrison had trusted future generations with his carefully preserved truth, and through a chain of stewardship that included 7 generations of Mercers, that trust had finally been fulfilled. The following morning, Thomas rose before dawn, as farmers had done for centuries, stepping onto his porch to survey fields now illuminated by first light. The rhythms of agricultural life continued, crops to plant, equipment to maintain, weather to monitor, unchanged in their essentials despite the historical magnificence that now shared the property. Yet, as he moved through his morning routine, checking irrigation systems and reviewing soil test results, Thomas carried a deeper awareness of his place in a continuity that stretched back through generations of Mercers to Harrison himself and the founding era he had documented. The land had always held this history. What had changed was the consciousness with which it was now tended. Eleanor joined him as he prepared to begin the day's work, bringing coffee and news from overnight emails. 3 more universities have requested research access, she reported, and the educational program has a waiting list through next spring. We're going to need more volunteer docents. Thomas nodded, simultaneously considering agricultural and historical planning. We should coordinate their visits with the heritage harvesting demonstrations. If they're studying colonial food systems, they might as well see actual heritage crops being gathered using period methods. This integration of farming and historical education had become the defining characteristic of the Mercer Center's approach, not separating the historical resources from their agricultural context, but demonstrating how they had always been interconnected. Visitors experienced not just static displays of colonial documents, but a living landscape that connected historical insights to continuing agricultural traditions. As they walked toward the equipment barn, they passed the site where Thomas had initially discovered the underground chamber. A simple marker now indicated the spot where his search for water had revealed historical treasure instead. The marker bore an inscription suggested by Dr. Hayes, but approved by Thomas for its perfect encapsulation of what had occurred. Here, a farmer seeking water uncovered history instead, revealing that the true wealth of this land lies not just in its fertile soil, but in the truths it has preserved through generations of careful stewardship. 1 year to the day after Thomas had first unrolled his grandfather's hidden map at the kitchen table, Mercer Farm hosted a gathering unlike any in its long history. Representatives from historical societies, universities, and preservation organizations joined local farmers, community members, and educators to celebrate the formal recognition of the Harrison Archive as a national historical treasure. The ceremony took place in the South Meadow where Thomas had once planned to drill a well. Now, this area featured the carefully preserved access to the underground chamber alongside fields still actively cultivated using a combination of heritage and modern sustainable techniques. This juxtaposition perfectly embodied the Mercer Center's unique approach, honoring historical significance without sacrificing continuing agricultural tradition. Dr. Hayes, now leading a major research initiative focused on the Harrison documents, addressed the assembled guests. What makes this site extraordinary isn't just the historical materials discovered here, remarkable though they are. It's the continuing connection between those materials and the agricultural landscape that preserved them. Here we see not just documents about America's past, but a living demonstration of the continuity that has sustained American ideals through generations of stewardship. Eleanor, whose professional stature had grown significantly through her work with the Harrison Archive, spoke about the educational programs that had already reached thousands of students. Harrison preserved these records because he believed future generations deserve to understand the complexities of how liberty was cultivated. Through our educational initiatives, young people are connecting with that complexity, understanding that American independence wasn't a single moment or document, but a gradual cultivation of ideas and courage, much like the cultivation of crops that continues on this land today. When Thomas's turn came to speak, he kept his remarks brief and direct, as befitted a farmer more comfortable with actions than words. My family has worked this land for 7 generations, not knowing what lay beneath it. Now we understand that we weren't just growing crops, we were protecting a historical legacy until the right time for it to emerge and flourish. That's what stewardship means. Caring for something beyond your full understanding because you trust in its value for future generations. As the ceremony concluded and guests dispersed to tour the property, Thomas found himself alone for a moment at the edge of the field, looking across the land that had sustained his family for generations. The search for water that had begun. This journey had eventually succeeded. A new well now supplied the farm's needs from a different location. But the true abundance that had flowed from his discovery couldn't be measured in gallons or bushels. Harrison had preserved historical truth beneath the soil, trusting that someday it would emerge to enrich understanding. 7 generations of Mercers had unknowingly protected that trust through their careful stewardship of the land. Now Thomas and Eleanor continued that tradition with new awareness, cultivating both crops and historical understanding for generations yet to come. The land remembered, even when those who tended it forgot, and in that remembering lay the deeper truth of American heritage. Not merely the documented words and deeds of founding figures, but the patient stewardship that had preserved both. Soil and story through centuries of quiet cultivation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.